Imagine an ordinary sunny day at the playground, full of joy and laughter of children, but in an instant, everything changes. A woman who seemed quite friendly suddenly kicks a little black girl out of the playground, but she doesn't stop there. In front of the other parents, she raises her hand against the girl without even thinking about the consequences. But what happened next? No one expected, including her. She didn't know who the girl's father was and what was ahead of her. Are you ready for this story? Then watch till the end, because the denouement will surprise you. We really want to know who you are and where you're watching us from. Write your name and city in the comments, so we can get to know our viewers better. You are really important to us. Each of your comments, likes and subscriptions help us promote the channel and create more stories that hook you. We appreciate each and every one of you. Enjoy the show. It was a warm, sunny morning, one of those rare days when the weather was perfect for a walk. A blue sky without a single cloud stretched over the busy city park, where the playground, surrounded by green trees and manicured flower beds, was the center of happiness and laughter. Children's laughter could be heard from different directions. Boys and girls were enthusiastically chasing each other, rolling down the brightly colored slides, swinging on swings that creaked to the beat of their enthusiastic cries. Families scattered brightly colored blankets around the playground, sitting on the grass, enjoying the warmth and picturesque nature while their children played. A sense of peace and security seemed to envelop this small area, where everyone seemed to be in harmony. On one of the benches, a young mother was carefully brushing the long hair of her daughter, who could not sit still in anticipation of a new game. Next to the slide, a little farther away, a father was lifting his baby in his arms, and the boy was laughing with pleasure, stretching his arms toward the sun as if he wanted to reach up to the sky. It seemed that nothing could march this morning. It was a day that belonged to children and their happy parents. Colorful toys were lying everywhere: balls, buckets, shovels. Children easily found each other to play with, even if they had never met before. There was no room for quarrels or prejudice. In this innocent world of the playground, there was joy and friendliness, at least at first glance. And, in the midst of all this happiness, a little black girl suddenly appears, quietly approaching the play area, gazing with delight at everyone around her. She was clearly eager to join this celebration of joy. At first, the girl hesitantly stopped aside, looking at the swings and noisy slides. But then she made up her mind, and with a slight trepidation, began to look for her place among the other children. Her eyes shone with joy, and she seemed ready to make friends and be part of this lively company. On this bright, seemingly perfect morning, nothing foreshadowed the events to come. None of the parents or children on the playground even suspected that a shadow was about to enter their rainbow world. That would change everything. Just when everyone around them was enjoying a carefree game, a little black girl slowly approached the playground. Her steps were cautious, as if she sensed beforehand that this place would not be as cozy for her as it was for the others. She looked around shyly, biting her lips slightly and trying not to draw attention to herself. She held a small doll in her hands, which she held close to her as if it were her only friend and protector. She walked over to the swings, where the children were taking turns, urging each other to give up their seats, and carefully stood aside, waiting for her turn. Her eyes shone with joy mixed with shyness. She seemed to long to just be part of the fun, to make friends with the children, to laugh with them. She didn't touch anyone, playing at a safe distance, content to be close and not be chased away. But soon one of the women, whose children were playing in the playground, was staring at her from somewhere to the side. Her gaze was filled with suspicion and judgment, cold, as if evaluating, and it glided over the girl's figure, studying every feature of her face. The woman shifted slowly from her bench, squinting her eyes like a predator sensing prey. Loudly, almost defiantly, she stood up and took a couple steps toward the children, her expression growing harder. Her lips tightened, and her eyes glittered with displeasure, as if breaking the silence. Her voice, barely audible but harsh, said, "Why is this girl here?" Her words seemed to fill the air, the hanging unspoken accusations, suddenly causing a wave of tension among the other parents. They began to glance around, as if deciding whether they should intervene or continue to look away, preferring not to notice what was happening. Meanwhile, the girl was still playing, unsuspecting. She was too absorbed in joy and happiness, swinging carelessly on the swing. But the woman could no longer stay still. Fury flashed in her eyes, backed by the prejudice and hatred that filled her mind. She turned toward the girl, sinister determination evident in her every movement. It seemed that at that moment, everyone on the playground felt the atmosphere change. Something dark and ominous suddenly appeared in the calm of the sunny day. As if from nowhere, filling the air with a sense of impending disaster, silence filled the playground, and everyone had the involuntary feeling that they had witnessed something unacceptable. The adults frowned, watching the woman who was heading toward the girl, and the children stopped laughing, sensing something wrong in the adults' behavior. No one yet understood what would happen next, but everyone felt fear, an almost instinctive sense that the innocence of this place and its peaceful atmosphere had been violated by something unforgivable. The woman stood closer to the girl, looking at her with a judgmental gaze that reflected squeamishness and dislike. Her eyes glittered with cold contempt, and she had an expression on her face as if she had discovered something dirty, inappropriate in this place where, in her opinion, only their own could play. Her whole posture betrayed her inner anger and barely restrained irritation. An inner voice told her that this girl did not belong here, that her presence was defiling the playground where her children were playing. It was as if she had convinced herself that she had the right to protect her place from outsiders. And the longer she stared at the girl, the stronger her resentment became. She looked at her son, who was playing next to the girl, and pressed her lips together, as if she already thought her child was in some kind of danger from the presence of this little visitor. At first, the woman tried to mutter something under her breath, but soon her voice grew louder, becoming more and more sarcastic. Her words were full of anger and sarcasm, and they echoed around the court, as if poisoning the air. And where it did come from, she muttered with blatant disdain, loud enough for those around her to hear. Some parents threw perplexed glances at her, but quickly turned away, not wanting to be drawn into this unpleasant scene. Nevertheless, the woman continued, and her words were increasingly hateful. "It's just amazing that now even here," she emphasized the word with contempt, "you can't hide from any. It's like a playground isn't a place for decent kids." She raised her voice deliberately so that the girl could hear her words, even if she couldn't fully understand their meaning. There was something predatory, cruel in the woman's eyes, as if her little remarks brought her pleasure. She looked at the girl with such disgust, as if she were an alien element, a threat to her peaceful world. Some of the parents furtively glanced over to see the woman literally exuding hatred. The girl felt the tension. She frowned, looking at the woman with confusion and fear in her eyes. But that woman, seeing this uncertainty, felt even more confident. Her defiance grew, and she could no longer stop. Every time she looked at the girl, more and more insulting thoughts, fueled by racial prejudice and feelings of superiority, came into her head. She cast another scornful glance at the girl and said quietly but distinctly, "Wonder how she was even allowed here. Aren't there other parks for places like this, too close to our children?" The woman was so consumed by her hatred that her words grew louder and louder, filling the playground with an atmosphere of fear and tension. Her prejudice was exposed and unconcealed. It was as if she was challenging anyone who dared to stand up for the girl, and that made the situation even more frightening. The girl, catching the adult's tone, stopped playing and, cradling her doll in her arms, tried to remain inconspicuous, but the woman had already made her the target of her dislike. The woman couldn't hold back any longer. She stepped closer to the girl and, no longer shy, spoke loudly so that everyone around her could hear. Her voice was saturated with disgust, which now seemed to want to display with full force, unleashing a verbal barrage of hatred on the girl with each word. "What are you even doing here?" she asked with blatant disdain. "Don't you realize that this is not a playground for people like you?" The woman's racially charged words echoed around the playground, attracting the attention of other parents and children. Some of the adults became uncomfortable, but they remained silent, consumed by their discomfort and inner fear of having to intervene. Meanwhile, the woman continued, her voice louder and louder, tearing the air of the quiet morning. "Why do I have to see this?" she continued indignantly, throwing the girl an annihilating glare. "Aren't there other places for people like you? Or do you think you can come here and act like we're equals?" The woman paused, glancing at the other parents, as if urging them to support her, to let her know that she was right. But her words only added to the awkwardness and shock around her, and no one dared to openly take her side. "Do you even realize that no one here wants you here?" She spoke again, her voice growing more and more venomous. Think about it. Here she is. She decides to come here, among our children, as if she has the right to do so. In every word she said, there was a cruelty and contempt that was completely out of place in a normal conversation, especially with a child. But the woman did not stop, as if the further she went, the more she enjoyed this moment, wanting to humiliate the girl so much that she left the playground, broken by her verbal blows. The girl, who no longer knew where to go from shame and fear, lowered her head, trying not to look in the woman's direction. She wrapped her arms around her doll and held it as tightly as if it were the only protection she had. But the woman's words, angry and barbed, seemed to pierce her, leaving marks on her little heart. People like you need to understand your place, the woman continued, not even trying to soften her cruelty. You shouldn't be here, do you understand? The children around them looked on in bewilderment, some whispering among themselves, unable to understand what had caused such anger in a grown woman. Parents were silent, as if paralyzed. Many lowered their eyes, not daring to intervene, feeling fearful of the tension that hung over the playground. The woman, seeing that no one was standing up for the girl, felt even more confident. She took another step, leaning toward the child to make her words sound even more threatening. I think you understand perfectly well, she said with a grim chuckle. You shouldn't be here, and if you don't leave on your own, I'm going to make you do it. With those words, the woman straightened up, as if giving the girl one last chance to get off the platform, and her gaze was filled with icy cruelty. The woman, furious to the extreme, could no longer contain her aggression. Her face contorted into a contemptuous expression, and she clenched her teeth and moved toward the girl as if she were something disgusting that needed to be removed from her path immediately. There was silence on the playground. Even the children seemed to sense the impending trouble and stood still, watching the frightening scene. Without giving the girl time to realize what was happening, the woman grabbed her slender wrist, squeezing it so hard that she cried out in pain. The scream sounded desperate and shrill, like an alarm, but the woman only squeezed her hand tighter, as if intent on crushing any resistance. You have no idea where you belong, she hissed, yanking the girl roughly toward the exit of the playground. And if you don't know that, I'll teach you. The girl, before she realized what was happening, felt herself being dragged away as if she were an unwanted object. She tried to break free, but the woman's grip was too strong. Her eyes were filled with fear and pain, and she tried to suppress her sobs, but they came out, exacerbating her sense of helplessness. The woman did not pay the slightest attention to the child's protest, but continued her tirade even louder and more vehemently, without thinking of how her words might hurt the girl. It was as if she had forgotten that she was just a child in pain and fear. How did you even think of coming here? Do you think you're welcome here? The woman said contemptuously, looking at the girl as if she was deeply disgusted with her. Don't you see that everything here is for normal children? Parents gathered around, looking at the woman with horror and judgment. Some of them wanted to say something, but fear and indecision kept them pinned to their seats. They watched as this woman, without the slightest shame, rudely kicked the girl out of the playground, humiliating her with every word. Get out of here and don't come back, she continued, clutching the girl's arm in a way that was sure to leave bruises. This place is not for people like you. We don't want strangers here. The girl, confused, tearfully tried to stop the woman, but she only pulled her harder, as if it were the only thing that could express her contempt. A sense of pain and shame flooded the child's mind, and her sobs were already attracting the attention of even those who until then had tried not to interface. Several parents, fists clenched in indignation, threw judgmental glances at the woman, but she didn't even notice them. Absorbed in her own anger, she continued to humiliate the girl, as if she were something unworthy, something dirty that needed to be gotten rid of. You have to realize, she finished, leading her towards the exit of the park, that there are places you just can't be, and this is one of them. The girl looked at her with tear-filled eyes, unable to understand why she had been rejected so cruelly, why she was being punished in this way. At that moment it was obvious that nothing would stop the woman, and even the judgmental glances that surrounded her did not weaken her resolve in the slightest. With an icy calmness hidden behind a blazing anger, it was as if she was happy to push the child out of that little zone of happiness and light that the girl only wanted to share with the other children. The girl, who could not understand why she was being shouted at and dragged, began to struggle with all her might. She tried to break free from the woman's grip, her whole small figure trembling with fear and despair. She sobbed and begged to be released, but her words only fueled the woman's rage. Her sudden movements and attempts to break free only increased the resentment of the adult, who now looked at the girl as a naughty creature she must put in her place. The woman stopped, feeling the anger boiling in her chest. She clenched her teeth and raised her hand without thinking of the consequences. There was no regret in her eyes, only contempt and rage. There was a dead silence on the platform. Even those who had tried to look away could not take their eyes off what was happening, like a nightmare unfolding before their eyes. The next second, her palm came down hard on the girl's cheek. The slam of the blow echoed across the playground, causing the children to freeze and some of the parents to flinch in horror. The impact was so strong that the girl lost her balance and staggered backward, barely able to stay on her feet. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment she frowned, unable to believe that it had really happened. Pain and humiliation overwhelmed her, and her small hand instinctively covered the reddened cheek that burned from the blow. The adults who witnessed this act of violence could not believe their eyes. Some sharply covered their mouths with their hands. Some looked at the woman judgmentally, but almost no one dared to intervene, stunned by the unexpected cruelty that had disturbed the tranquility of the playground. Meanwhile, a woman, breathing heavily from excitement, looked at the girl with cold satisfaction, as if the blow was not just revenge for her, but confirmation of her right to this place, to her world. She no longer saw the child in front of her. For her, the girl was just an object to be put in her place, to be made to obey. "That's it," the woman said sharply, her voice announcing anger. "Now maybe you realize that you can't come in here." Her words sounded like a final blow, and there was so much cruelty and resentment in them that even the adults, who had previously tried to stay out of the way, felt tainted by the scene. The impact on the playground sounded like a thunderclap and threw everyone into a daze. Parents and children, who just a moment ago were enjoying the carefree atmosphere, frowned in place, as if the scene before them was part of some horrible nightmare. Everyone around them seemed petrified, unable to believe that they had just witnessed a grown man hitting a defenseless child. The first reaction was fear, as if the air had become colder and heavier. No one dared to utter a word. The silence was more frightening than the loudest scream. Several parents standing closer looked at each other in horror, their eyes full of indignation and condemnation, but paralyzed by what was happening. They didn't know how to react. Someone, clutching a phone in their hand, automatically pressed record, trying to capture the scene, not realizing how inaction made them complicit in this horror. The people who filmed had mixed feelings: disgust, confusion, and an ever-growing fear. The small children who saw what was happening also frowned, not fully understanding what they had just seen, but feeling inexplicably afraid of this woman whose anger was directed at the girl. Some of the little ones clutched their parents' hands tighter, as if seeking their protection, but even the adults could not comfort them, as they themselves could not overcome the shock. The girl, with her head down and crying, looked so helpless that everyone around her could feel her pain but did not dare to approach. Some of the parents were whispering, their voices muffled, as if they were afraid to be heard by this woman, who stood breathing heavily and looking around with cold certainty. She knew they were judging her, saw their shocked faces, but it seemed to strengthen her in her right. She liked their silent agreement, that unspoken support that she felt validated her actions. Among the parents in the crowd stood a man who clenched his fists, his face expressing anger, but he never stepped forward, paralyzed by the fear that he would be the next object of the woman's attacks. He wanted to step forward, to intervene, but his inner fear of the possible consequences stopped him, as if someone invisible was holding him in place. Another woman covered her mouth with her hand to stifle an outcry, but even that gesture was filled with fear. There was a tension in the air, thick and overwhelming, as if before a storm. It was as if the presence of evil had filled the stage, transforming it from a cozy corner into a place of fear and helplessness. No one dared to approach, which made the scene even more terrifying. As if time stood still, frozen in this horror. Everyone saw what had happened. Everyone felt the need to intervene, but everyone was afraid to break the gloomy silence. The children, not understanding why the adults did not do anything, continued to look at the girl, at her tears and reddened face. It was as if everything human on that playground had disappeared, leaving only a shadow of fear, anger, and injustice. At the moment when silence and fear seemed to have taken over, a young man, the girl's older brother, who had noticed from afar that something was amiss, swiftly approached the playground. His eyes immediately locked on his sister, who was crying, her face reddened from the blow, and the woman who stood nearby, not hiding a contemptuous look. His face tensed and anger boiled in him. He walked quickly over to his sister, lifting her by the shoulders and saying with restraint, "Are you okay? What happened?" The girl sobbed and tried to answer, but her small hands were still trembling with fear. At this time, a woman, noticing his approach and sensing that her actions might now be questioned, crossed her arms over her chest defiantly, maintaining a haughty expression. Her brother, looking at her with cold and angry eyes, turned to her with a direct question. "What have you done to my sister? Why is she crying? Why is her face red?" The woman rolled her eyes, and her face contorted into a contemptuous grin. Her voice was cold and smug. "Your sister needs to know her place and realize she's not welcome here. I was just showing her that there are rules and boundaries that should not be crossed." The words sounded like an open challenge, and fury flashed in his brother's eyes for a moment. He exhaled, trying to keep his composure, but his voice hardened. "You hit a child just because you didn't like her. Do you even realize that that's unacceptable?" The woman did not avert her gaze and stood there with a look of triumph, as if she even enjoyed the fact that her words and actions were eliciting such a reaction. Her voice became even colder and her tone even more dismissive. "Unacceptable," she interjected, arching an eyebrow derisively. "I don't think it's acceptable for people like her to come here. She doesn't belong here, among decent people." The words sounded like a final blow, and the girl's brother couldn't hold back any longer. His hands clenched into fists, and he opened his mouth to reply, but held back, trying to control himself. Seeing his rage, the woman grinned, her face a look of utter contempt, as if she knew her words would touch him. "You have no idea who you're messing with," he said, his voice tinged with anger, but at the same time firm and confident. "You think you can behave the way you want just because she's a child and can't defend herself." The woman frowned for a moment, but quickly regained her composure, her voice becoming even more sarcastic. "It's you who have no idea where you belong. If you don't want any trouble, take her out of here and don't show up again," she said, trying to sound confident, but a shadow of worry flickered in her eyes. The girl's brother, barely containing his rage, stepped closer to her, a promise in his voice that he wouldn't just leave it at that. "We'll see each other again. I promise you that there will be consequences for your actions." With those words, he gently embraced his sister, leading her away from the platform, but in parting, he cast a look at the woman full of contempt and the certainty that this confrontation was far from over. When the girl's brother gave the woman a grim, warning glance and led his sister away from the playground, the woman stood for a while, convinced that she was right. Her eyes glittered with contempt and cold fury, and she looked around proudly, expecting that someone might approve of her actions. But most of the parents turned away, their faces expressing resentment and disapproval. And then, from behind her back, came a low, cautious whisper. "Do you realize what you just did? Do you know who her father is?" The woman flinched, turning around and looking perplexed at the mother of one of the children, who was looking at her anxiously and distrustfully. It was a subtle hint, but from the expression on her face and the tension in her voice, the woman realized there was something more behind the question. She frowned, not immediately realizing why it was so important, and waved it away dismissively. "So, what's the difference? I did what I thought was right," she replied defiantly, unwilling to admit that her actions might have had consequences. But the other child's mother, coming closer, whispered again, this time with obvious alarm. "You don't seem to understand. Her father is a person's name." She said his name barely audibly, as if she was afraid her voice might be heard by someone important. The words frowned in the air, and their meaning finally reached the woman. Her confident expression slowly changed to confusion and then to fear. The name spoken in a whisper was painfully familiar to her. This was a man who had been rumored to be both respected and feared. He wasn't just influential, he wielded such power and strength that to oppose him was tantamount to suicide. He was known for his strict stance towards protecting his loved ones and had the means to punish anyone who dared to harm his family. The seconds dragged on, and the woman's face grew paler and paler, her eyes widening with horror as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. Now scraps of thoughts began to run through her mind. What if he found out she'd hit his daughter? What if he saw this video, which surely someone had already taken? The other parent's words began to sound like a judgment. You don't understand. He's not the forgetting type, someone in the crowd added, adding to her anxiety. You don't want to mess with a man like that. The woman stepped back slowly, her confidence completely dissipated, her stomach clenched with fear, a sense of panic that grew with each passing second. She no longer felt right. All her beliefs and preconceptions crumbled in an instant. Now it seemed to her that everyone around her knew of her mistake. Everyone saw her blunder, and it seemed to her that an invisible judgment surrounded her. The woman felt her heart beating with painful force. Her thoughts raced around in her head. What can I do? How can this be fixed? Maybe I can manage to explain myself. She realized that her reputation, her safety, and her familiar world were all in jeopardy. As the reality of what she had done and the possible consequences began to settle in her mind, the woman felt a wave of panic wash over her. Her fingers trembled, her breathing became labored, and her heart pounded as if it were about to jump out of her chest. She looked around, trying to figure out how many people had seen what had happened, who had recorded it on their phones, and, most importantly, who among them could spread the tape. I didn't mean that, she said, her voice shaking like a man against a wall. She tried to give herself her former confident look, but now it looked clumsy and desperate. It's just a misunderstanding. I didn't know that. She faltered, realizing that her excuses sounded ridiculous. She ran her hand nervously over her face, her gaze darting from one parent to the other. Each seemed to look at her with judgment and contempt, and in those looks she saw more threat than before. Fear gripped her. What if this really got out? What if someone sent the video to the local news or the police? Her life could be ruined in a matter of hours once this information went viral on the internet and social media. Please, it was a misunderstanding. She tried to justify herself to one of the women standing nearby. Her voice was choppy and her confidence was gone. I didn't mean to. I just thought she... But her pathetic attempts to explain herself only caused more resentment. The parents around her were clearly not in the mood to listen to her, and she could see it. With every word she tried to say for herself, her voice grew quieter, as if the words were stuck in her throat. She was overcome with the horror of realizing that what had happened could not be changed. Everything was out of her control. She began to look around for a way out, as if she hoped to escape from this place and disappear. Her heart clenched with fear that her name, her face, would be in the news, that everyone would know what she had done. She imagined the headlines, the outraged comments condemning her actions. The thought that her life could turn into a nightmare was becoming more and more real, and with each passing moment, her panic grew more intense. Look, I really didn't mean it, she mumbled in a broken voice, turning to the people around her again, trying to find some understanding. But instead of sympathy, she met only cold stares and total rejection. She realized there was nowhere to retreat. The realization that she would be punished perhaps by the girl's father, or even by the authorities, made her feel trapped. Now all she could do was stand there, panic-stricken and regretful, realizing that by her actions she had ruined her own life. In the midst of her panic, when she was already realizing the hopelessness of the situation, the silence of the playground was broken by sure, heavy footsteps. She felt it before she saw it. The sudden silence and breathlessness of the others made her look around. A man, tall and imposing, entered the playground, his face cold and intense and his eyes piercing the space before him, leaving no look or gesture unnoticed. It was the girl's father. The surrounding parents, sensing his presence, instinctively took a step back, as if to give him a way out. There was no doubt in his expression. This was a man who had come to defend his family and punish those who dared to harm it. There was no doubt or confusion on his face, only an icy calm that hid a storm of restrained rage. The woman felt a chill run down her spine when his gaze finally settled on her. That gaze, full of anger and contempt, seemed to burn through her, as if he could see through her all her thoughts, all her prejudices and petty cruelty. She realized that he was aware of all that she had done to his daughter. For the first time in all this time, she felt truly small and vulnerable in front of him. The man slowly stepped closer to her without averting his gaze. His face remained stony, but the tense muscles in his neck and tightly clenched fist showed his effort to hold back his raging anger. His eyes blazed with the promise of retribution, not instantaneous, not fierce, but slow and inevitable. "Did you hit my daughter?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper, but it was so threatening that the woman's legs gave out. She tried to look away, but felt she couldn't. She was literally pinned down by fear. She opened her mouth, trying to say something, to explain, but the words stuck in her throat. The man waited, not taking his eyes off her, and his patience seemed as frightening as the calm before a hurricane. I didn't know," the woman began, but her voice trembled and her phrase broke off. "I didn't think it would come out like this." The man tilted his head to the side, his lips quivering slightly in a grin devoid of any mirth. "You didn't think," he repeated, each sound as weighty as a sentence. "You weren't thinking when you humiliated a child. You weren't thinking when you raised your hand to someone who couldn't even defend himself." Every word he said pressed down on her like a heavy weight, keeping her from breaking free from the embrace of panic and fear. She could feel the cold sweat running down her back, her legs trembling slightly, but she couldn't move like a cornered animal. "I don't care about your excuses," he continued, his voice growing colder. "You have no idea what you're going to have to answer for now." He spoke softly, but each sound was like a wave that made her shrink inwardly, terrified of the inevitable reckoning. The man stepped forward so that they were almost face to face. He stood so close that she could feel his labored breathing, his unspoken anger and unyielding determination. She no longer tried to justify herself. The fear that filled her heart was all-encompassing. She knew now that her actions had had consequences from which there was no escape. It seemed to her that the man's every word sounded like a curse, and she had no choice but to stand before him, realizing that her life would never be the same again. After that ominous meeting with the girl's father, events at the playground unfolded with inexorable speed. By evening, a short video shot by eyewitnesses went viral on social networks, instantly causing a wave of outrage. Thousands of comments, ranging from anger to bewilderment and shock, were left under the video by people outraged by the cruelty and bias of the woman who dared to raise her hand against a defenseless child. Society was outraged, and many people demanded that she be punished. Her name quickly became known. Some even found out where she worked and contacted her employer, demanding consequences for her behavior. People could not believe that such cruelty and hatred was possible in their community and increasingly insisted that such incidents should not go unchecked. The next day, the woman learned that her actions had been condemned at work, and she was soon summoned for an explanation. Faced with the judgmental stares of management and co-workers, she was unable to say a word in her defense. All her attempts to explain that she didn't think it would resonate like this sounded pathetic and pointless. She was fired from her job and soon realized that no one around her wanted to support her after what she had done. In addition, the girl's father filed a police report and an investigation into her violent actions began. She became the focus of law enforcement attention and was soon brought to trial. As part of the trial, she was charged with child assault and gross disorderly conduct. The judge and the community were adamant that she be punished for her abuse and the horrible words that came out of her mouth that day. She was sentenced to compulsory community service and a tolerance re-education course, which she agreed to, having no choice. The community affected by this incident reacted strongly. The parents who witnessed the scene now realized that it was unacceptable to remain silent in the face of such cruelty and prejudice. Local meetings began to discuss how to create a safe and open space for all children, regardless of their background or color. Initiative groups emerged, working to ensure that informational materials about the importance of respect and tolerance appeared on playgrounds and in schools. Families who had previously been mere spectators on the playground now decided that they would never turn a blind eye to such manifestations. This case was a wake-up call for many, a reminder that prejudice and hatred should have no place in their lives. Parents became more sensitive, explaining to their children the importance of equality. At local schools held assemblies to talk to students about the unacceptability of discrimination and violence. The incident at the playground served as a bitter lesson and a turning point, illuminating the darker sides of society that, thankfully, now have a chance to be changed. Now that woman, isolated and rejected by society, could only regret the act that had ruined her life. She became a symbol of how one moment of prejudice and cruelty can lead to retribution, ruin reputations, and leave a dark mark on the lives of many. Friends, this story touches on very important and painful topics. Write in the comments what you think about this situation. What would you do if you were the witnesses? Have you or your relatives ever faced such manifestations of racism? It is important for us to know your opinion, because each of your comments and support helps us to create even more meaningful and valuable materials. Each of you is incredibly important to us, and we really appreciate your attention and participation in our channel. Don't forget to subscribe and put a like to support us and not to miss new stories. We wish you a wonderful day and thank you for being with us.